that does require some work on their part. And some of that is in terms of quality content. Obviously, if you have quality content, you'll be able to get more consumers, but you need to put the pipes in place so that you can actually get that media validated and measured and targeted correctly.
Hey gang, it's Thursday, October 28th. Welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Neustar. I'm Marcus. Today's fact: it takes 68 days to swim the full length of the Mississippi River. My natural reaction after reading this is, who the hell is trying to do that? Well, marathon swimmer Martin Steele, apparently. On July 4th, 2002, he began his journey in northern Minnesota. It's insane. That saw him making his way down the 2,500-mile Mississippi River in an effort to become the first person to swim its entire length. On September 9th, 2 months later, he reached his goal, ending up in the Gulf of Mexico in Louisiana after an incredible 68-day journey. That's about 35 miles a day. Why, Martin? Why? Because, it's bloody incredible. Who are we kidding? That's like swimming across the whole country, which is about 3,000 miles. That's like swimming America, the whole thing. Insane. It's tough enough to drive. Anyway, today we are starting the show with a conversation between our very own eMarketer principal analyst and head of our advertising and marketing practice, Paul Verna, and the SVP of Product and GM at Neustar Steve Silvers. Today, they'll be discussing companies' preparedness for the removal of the third-party cookie and device IDs and some best practices on transitioning to a privacy-centric future. After that, I'll see you in the second half for a few in other news stories.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Marcus. And Steve, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Paul. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about talking to you guys today.
Excellent. All right, well, let's jump right in. How prepared would you say most measurement and syndication vendors are today for the removal of third-party cookies and device IDs?
So, it's a great question. Most of the measurement and syndication vendors out there, they're not necessarily empowered themselves to fix these problems. There are very few vendors in the marketplace like Neustar that happens to have their own identity graph in addition to doing the other things. And so most of them are dependent on what other folks are doing. So if you think about, the publishers themselves, and actually, I guess we're also kind of beholden to them as well. The publishers and the brands really hold all the power in terms of the identity graph that they want to use, the IDs they're going to support, and any other technologies they're putting in place. And then, most of the other folks are kind of stuck in the middle. And so, we can support as many or as few IDs as we choose to. And we are supporting many. But until there is real inventory with those IDs and that the brands themselves have bought in, they're kind of empty pipes. And so we're doing what we can, but there are some things that we probably should be doing that we're not. And one of those is that what we've really been focused on for the last 18 months is identified solutions, these login-based solutions, mostly super magical hashed email solutions. And the vast majority of publishers, at least the ones that we talk to, and unless you're a Google or a Facebook or someone like that, you're really not getting enough logins to really fill the pipes. And so, we're trying now to focus on other ways to do measurement and targeting that don't require a login event, but still in a privacy safe way, so that we can kind of fill that gap and cover those impressions that don't have those things on them. But I guess what I've seen is that, most folks are still focused on those identified solutions because that's what has gotten most press. And both on the brand side, the publisher side, and on the vendor side, that still seems to be the focus. And I suspect as we go into 2022, that focus is going to have to shift because there's just not going to be enough impressions with those identified events on them to fill the gap.
What options do advertisers and their partners have to maintain measurement and addressability?
So I think there are multiple approaches that can be taken. And one of the things I do think that people are doing is they're kind of tunnel visioning on one, But there's several different things that need to be done. Obviously, like I said, what we've seen is that when consumers self-identify to publishers, that traffic is extremely valuable. And it's extremely valuable to advertisers, and the CPMs on impressions that where a consumer self-identifies is going to be much higher. And so publishers do need to do as much as they can to get consumers to self-identify. And frankly, so do brands. Some brands have more access to that today. E-commerce retailers, more DTC brands have more access to direct consumer information. Others don't. We all need to get that number up. Now, the average website today has, maybe around 5% of self-identified traffic. And that's a pretty low number. It's a surprising number to anyone who isn't a publisher, but we need to get that number up. I don't know exactly how high. We still are working on the math of that, but let's just say that, it's at 5% now. We need to get it at 20%, which is, a 4x improvement. It's still way below 100%, right? So getting it to 20% would be great. That's going to be better for publishers and advertisers. It's going to command a higher CPM. But what's interesting about that number, and again, I made 20% up. I don't know what the number is, what the number needs to be. But if we have a big enough number there, we can use that self-declared traffic as a panel to help us value the rest of the media. And I think this is something that's going to become more of a focus, again, as we go into 2022, is what do we do with that other 80% to make it valuable? And then how do we use the 20% of people that are self-declared to value that other 80%? So you can get as close to 100% possible measurability and addressability. So what you're going to see a lot of folks talking about in the next year is things like contextual targeting and first-party behavioral. Now, those are great tools. They're tools that have been around a really long time. But the issue with them to date has been that without a third-party cookie or some sort of third-party identifier, you couldn't really measure the effectiveness of those buys, nor could you match your own first-party segments to those contextual and behavioral segments. Now, what this panel will allow you to do is to get enough of it, because everyone's going to have the contextual and behavioral segments on them, but only the people that self-declare are we going to have that ID, that authenticated ID. But the overlap between those things should be enough to value the contextual and behavioral. But we need everyone to be thinking about it that way, and they're not. And I think that's something that we kind of need the industry to move towards, is thinking about it as using the one to value the other versus thinking them as binary things or completely separate things. And I think that is holding us back. And we've been buying contextual completely separate from the behavioral audience targeting for so long that people are kind of stuck in their ways, and we need to break those silos down, because that's going to drive the most value for everybody. Because if we can do that correctly, then the brands, the people who are buying, can really value the media that's bought on these other channels, and that will drive CPMs for the publishers because they'll be able to be connected to actual sales via that panel.
Do you think looking at 2022 that publishers are going to have more agency in monetizing their own inventory, or the pendulum might swing a little bit more that way, if you will? Because, let's face it, right now, there's a huge dominance by this, duopoly or triopoly. But do you see any change in that, that mix?
So I do. And I do think that publishers have an opportunity to swing the pendulum their way, but it does require some work on their part. And some of that is really in terms of quality content. Obviously, if you have quality content, you'll be able to get more consumers, but you need to put the pipes in place so that you can actually get that media validated and measured and targeted correctly. The reason that, the big social networks are so powerful is because their authentication rate is so high. And so not only do they have a lot of engagement, but who the people are on the other side of the screen.
Right.
And that makes each impression so much more valuable. And they're able to kind of pretty much dictate how everyone else operates with them. And so publishers that aren't part of that big three, they obviously, if they can get a higher level authentication, or they can put the framework in place using something like contextual to enable more bilateral sales, I think that publishers can get a lot more value out of their inventory that way, but they need to be forward thinking And then they need to work with their best customers to negotiate those deals. And so I think, most of our clients are brands. So we normally think of this from a brand perspective, but you can think of this from the publisher perspective too, is that, without third-party cookies, most media probably ends up getting bought direct, or at least most of the money gets spent direct, even if it's not most of the impressions. And so the more, as a publisher, the more you can move into that direct channel, obviously the CPMs tend to be higher there. So you're incentivized to do it, and making deals with your brands to create good data sharing agreements to make those feasible, I think is a great plan for publishers.
What are some red flags and areas that both advertisers and their partners need to look out for as vendors approach them with a one-stop shop type solution?
So my personal advice to everybody on both sides here is to not abdicate responsibility for your relationship with your customers, your consumers, and your data governance. Anyone that's stepping in and telling you they're going to take care of all of that, I think is going to get you in trouble in the long run. So that's thing number one. And thing number two is anyone who tells you that just doing this one thing is going to fix the problem for you is also probably throwing smoke.
Yeah.
There is no one tactic. There is no one identifier that's going to get you the scale that you are used to on either side. You're going to have to go multimodal. So anyone who's trying to tell you that if you just do the one thing, it's going to work out, is probably being disingenuous.
So trust, but verify, and don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right. And, one of the things that we've done at Neustar just to try to, to play that out is, we have our own ID, the Fabric ID, but we're also supporting several other identifiers and a variety of other solutions, because there's no one identifier that's going to be everywhere. It's just not going to happen. And, with a third-party cookie, you could, sort of accidentally be someplace because you'd seen someone someplace else, but that's not going to exist anymore. And so you're going to have to use a variety of different things to get, as a buyer of media, you just want to make sure that you're buying all your audience in all the ways that it makes sense. And you don't want to have to worry about whose BD team negotiated the deal and get the ID on the page. You just want to make sure that you're buying the impressions. And so you're going to have, it's like between being a single currency and being multi-currency, we're global companies. We have to think in dollars and pounds and euros and yen. And it's going to be the same way in advertising.
And how is Neustar helping their clients audit their partners' preparedness?
So we have something called the Fabric Impact Assessment. And we think of it, first and foremost, it's auditing their own preparedness, because we believe that our clients need to take an empowered, responsible approach and take a look at what they are doing, but also look at the ways that they are buying media, the way those media outlets are, the IDs that those outlets have available, and then how they're incorporating that into their graph along with their own data. And so it's more of a holistic thing versus a measuring stick for their vendors, because the first thing that we always tell our clients is you need to clean up your own house first, because you could have great first party data, and a lot of our clients do, but if they aren't going through the processes to make sure that they have access to that data, they can use that data, and then they have to make sure they're working with vendors that they can match those IDs to. And we can help, but they need to kind of have an idea of what it is they want to do, who their clients are, and what their data strategy is going to be. And we start there. And then we help them evaluate their existing vendors and suggest new ones.
So the last question, Steve, what are some best practices or recommendations that you have for both sides of the supply chain that you think will help them transition to a privacy-centric future?
So I think the biggest mistake we make here is that we equate cookie and ID deprecation with privacy-centric. They're happening at the same time. They may or may not be happening for the same reasons, but doing one without the other, it's all about data governance and having the discussion with your consumers about what you're collecting and why, and building that trust with the consumer. And that is the number one thing that we all have to do. And that there's a communication element, and there's also a data governance element. And in the past, we have not done a good job of articulating what data we're collecting and how we're using it, and then maintaining that throughout our platforms. That is what we have to do first. And so, like I said, we always tell our clients, get your house in order first, and then we can work on your vendors. But if you don't have your house in order and you don't have a plan, whatever we do with your vendors isn't going to matter.
Words of wisdom. Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate your taking time.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
All right, time for a quick break from our sponsor, Neustar, and then we'll be right back with the conversation. Are you prepared for marketing's next chapter? You won't want to miss Brave New Worlds 2021, the virtual marketing and analytics event of the year on November 9th and 10th. Join Brave New Worlds to learn how you can adapt to the forces redefining advertising. It's free, and you'll hear from today's top minds in marketing, data, and analytics, including executives from Facebook, General Motors, Capgemini, Publicis, and more. Go to bravenewworlds.newstar to register today. All right, folks, we are joined by Paul again for the second half of the show. Paul, thanks for sticking around.
Thanks again for having me again.
Absolutely, sir. Today, in other news, how do the CTV giants hold on to new customer gains? YouTube is expanding its video action campaigns. And where would folks prefer to watch movies? Story 1, CTV streaming hours ballooned. Connected TV streaming hours ballooned during the pandemic, notes Adweek's Molly Cahillane. She points out that Amazon's Fire TV reported 50 million monthly active users last year. That's up 25% year on year. Roku had 55 million of its own active accounts in Q2 of this year, up 28% year on year. And in the same quarter, Q2, Vizio Smartcast accounts spiked 43% to hit 14 million. And streaming hours were up as well. Paul, despite all these really impressive numbers, how do these CTV giants hold on to those new customer gains?
Well, it's easier said than done because a lot of these services launched around the same time with promotional pricing or free bundles.
Yep.
And they launched at a time when, for many companies doing business, the pandemic was an awful time. Obviously, restaurants, hotels, airlines, etc. But if you were a streaming service, it was probably a good time to launch because you just had all this, you had this big captive audience that was spending more time streaming. So
extra free time. Yep.
Yeah. So I think it benefited these services and it got them off to a strong start. What happens next? I think now is really when that starts because, we're about a year plus into when a lot of the higher profile services launched. There have been some other ones that have crept up in the meantime. And at the end of the day, they're all competing for the same, eyeballs. I mean, obviously, there's some demographic segmentation and some genre specialization, but for the most part, people only have so much time in the day. And there are a lot of great shows across these channels. People also have limited budgets. So really what it comes down to is just having great programming. I was somewhat skeptical of Apple TV on this podcast because I didn't see that they were coming through with anything, that seemed like a must watch. And then suddenly Ted Lasso came along and changed the conversation. So I think if other streaming services can, muster those kinds of moments and make those kinds of connections with their audiences, then that's the key to retaining their customers. I think, Marcus, you've made the point on the podcast that even though people have limited budgets, that's not a hard number where they say, okay, I'm going to cap it at, $39 a month. I mean, if something great comes along and they have to extend a subscription for a few months to watch, 12 episodes of a show and pay an extra, $12, that's not going to be a deal breaker for a lot of people. So it really comes down to the quality of the content. And then if you have enough quality content to spreading it out, spreading the wealth during the calendar year so that you're not getting that churn of people quitting when you don't have something for them.
To that point, there was a data point I saw the other day, content licensing technology company Whip Media, 7 out of 10 people said there are too many premium streaming services. Too many, 7 out of 10 said. However, they also have an average of close to 5 services each and plan to add one more, according to this research. In terms of US, connected TV ad spending will reach $14 billion this year, growing in roughly $5 billion increments each of the next few years. $14 billion this year is good enough for 7% of all digital ad spending in the US. Story 2. YouTube is expanding its video action campaigns, one of Google's interactive video ad placements, to CTV to increase the shoppability of YouTube ads, notes eMarketer briefing director Jeremy Goldman. How does it work? Well, when you're served a video action campaign on your connected TV, a clickable URL appears at the bottom of the screen that will take you to the brand's website on your computer or smartphone without interrupting the viewing experience. Paul, your reaction to this news?
Well, I think it's a recognition of the fact that people tend to watch TV with their phone handy.
Yeah.
And I think that previous attempts to make ads shoppable really only worked if you were on the desktop or on the mobile device. But once you're on that connected TV and you're accessing it with a remote control instead of with a keyboard or a mouse, it gets a little bit harder to click through. So I think this is a good way to approach it. I know that a lot of streaming services will have you authenticate on your phone or
Yes.
on your desktop anyway. So that connection is getting stronger. And
Yeah, familiar behavior.
yeah, it seems like a good way to crack the code. Now, whether it's going to take off as a concept or whether the execution will be what it needs to be, we'll see how that plays out. But
Yeah.
it seems like a step in the right direction.
We estimate that there are 124 million Americans who watch YouTube on their connected TVs. That is over half of all the YouTube viewers. And a recent YouTube company blog post noting that 1 in 4 logged in YouTube CTV viewers are watching primarily on TV screens. Story 3, new civic science research looked at where folks would prefer to watch movies. It found a couple of things. Number 1, 3 times as many people would prefer to watch at home than go to the movies. 3 times as many. For over 55s, it was 5-1 in favor of watching at home. For college-age people, 2-1 in favor of home. Number 2, just over half of folks are comfortable going to the movies sometime in the next month. Number 3, when movies are released in a movie theater and on streaming platforms at the same time, just over half of people prefer watching them at home. Just under half prefer the movie theater. And number 4, most, 66% of people were only willing to pay less than $10 to stream a newly released film. Paul, what stood out to you the most about this civic science research?
Well, probably the demographic-based, dichotomy here and it's pretty obvious. I mean, I think older people are more comfortable kind of, staying home. And most of the films that are screened in movie theaters these days are blockbuster franchise-type films, action movies that are definitely not aimed at that audience. So I think it makes sense that there is a disparity. But I think this also points out the challenges that the theatrical film industry is facing because, even the stats for younger people are not that favorable if you're a theater chain. So frankly, I think the ship has sailed and the better the experience gets at home and the more, higher resolution TVs, better sound, bigger screens, like all of those things are happening and the ante just keeps getting pushed up. So all of that makes for a better experience. And then suddenly like sitting in a theater, where you don't really know who sat in the chair before you or whether it was cleaned or whether someone's going to be talking or chewing gum or popcorn behind you, like all of those things start to color the experience. So it definitely tilts toward the home experience.
Yes, sir. That's all we've got time for. Thank you so much, Paul, for hanging out.
Pleasure as always.
Thank you to Steve, who joined Paul in the first half. Thank you to Victoria. She edits the show. Thank you to everyone listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen, a eMarketer podcast made possible by Neustar.